Before I make the next call, I'm just going to make a brief explanation for my reasoning for making the call. Carmel Cipollone took the initial two calls before leave was taken to have part 1 and 2 together. I am ruling that since that leave, there is a new question, and therefore Ms Cepollone's earlier calls do not count against this question. Carmel Cipollone.
Mr Chair, thank you very much. Mr Chair, I just want to refer to what the former member was just saying, and that was that that they are measuring success. That government is measuring success on the number of young people they can get off benefits. Well, Mr Chair, that is not and should not be a measure of success, because the actual success is where these young people go on to. But we're not getting the information from the government to tell us that actually these people are going on to anything better. Mr Chair, I was talking to my colleague Penny Henare earlier tonight. We were having discussions about the fact that we were both teen parents, or perhaps I had mine at 20, pregnant at 19. And we can't even imagine the conditions that this government is trying to impose on young people having been imposed on us. And we were just talking about the fact that we don't even know any young people who, around our age group, stayed on a benefit for a long period of time after having a child as a teenager. In fact, we heard Alfred Ngaro say that if a person has a child as a teenager, they are more likely to stay on the benefit for something like 13 years. Bill English said the other day that if a young person goes on a benefit, they are likely to stay on a benefit for an average of 18 years. Where is the government getting these figures from? I put PQs in to try and find out where Bill English got that number from, and that answer is now delayed. We have no response from that side of the House because they do not have any evidence to support the statements they're making, Mr Chair, and that is the problem. Going back to myself and Penny and other people that had children when they were young, and other people that had to rely on a benefit for a certain period of time, actually most of us have aspirations, and most of us went on to get jobs, and most of us went on to continue studying or get further education, and we weren't the exception, actually, National Government. We were the rule. And so that side of the House is creating legislation around a small, very, very small group of people and saying that youth services should only be available to the very, very, very at-risk group that they've identified through their predictive risk modelling. And that deficit base, Mr Chair, that deficit base sets that program up to fail, and we know that. We know that in the classroom when you're teaching, with anything that you do. If you have a deficit base, then you are setting it up to fail. So, Mr Chair, we don't support the model that that government has come up with. And, Mr Chair, it's not just us that don't support it, because I do want to refer to some of the submissions that came through and the concerns that they expressed about this bill. So the first one I'm going to refer to is the submission made by the Salvation Army. So, quoting the Salvation Army, in general, the Salvation Army opposes the intent and much of the content of the bill. The principal reason for this opposition is that the Army believes that it is both paternalistic and somewhat contradictory to treat 18 and 19-year-olds in the same way as 16 and 17-year-olds. The Army believes that it is important to respect individuals' legal and civil rights ahead of particular policy objectives which may in themselves be of questionable value. It is the Army's opinion that the proposed extension of young person services and the associated obligation and sanctions to 18 and 19-year-olds is a clear example of the state placing its policy objectives ahead of the legitimate rights of citizens, and that as a practice, this is unwise and unfair. End quote. And I value what the Salvation Army has to say, actually. The Salvation has a lot to say of substance in this area, so it's such a pity that the National Government have ignored what they have to say. And they did mention the issue around sanctions here, and I want to speak a little bit to that, Mr Chair. There was a submission made by Kay Breton on behalf of the National Beneficiary Advocacy Consultation Group, and they speak a little about the consequences of sanctions in this context. And as a person who not only was a young parent, not only was on a benefit for a period of time, but didn't stay on for 18 years, like Bill English said we do. I also worked with youth for a period of time. So John O'Naylor says he worked with young people and thinks he was the only one in the House that has. And Mr Chair, the concern that I have as a person who worked for a youth service is that actually I think that the ability to sanction by these youth services compromises their ability to do the job properly. How can you form a trusting relationship with a young person when you at any time can contact Work and Income New Zealand and have their benefit cancelled, have them sanctioned in some way? What kind of motivation is it, Mr Chair? Mr Chair? What kind of motivation are you instilling in the young person when the only motivation you're giving to them for actually staying in line, doing the things they're supposed to be doing, is actually, otherwise you cut their benefit? What happens to the importance of a youth service and youth workers actually being about instilling in this young person a passion for getting out and getting further education, a passion for getting into work that they're interested into, Mr Chair? What about, instilling life skills in a young person and walking alongside them so that actually you can give them hope that there may be something out there better for them, and that, Mr Chair, should be the motivation, not the motivation being, I will pull your benefit if you don't do what I tell you to do, Mr Chair. So we've got real issues with the fact that the government are making the youth services do that. And we have to remember, Mr Chair, that actually this really is in so many ways just a matter of the government contracting out the case management of these clients. It's not really about them trying to create decent youth service provision. It's about them devolving responsibility for these young people to these service providers. So we've got issues with that. Mr Chair, I have brought up earlier, my colleagues have brought up earlier, that there were concerns raised by the Human Rights Commission in their submission that this discriminates against young people. And actually, just because these are young people who found themselves in an undesirable situation where they've had to come for support to the state, to go on a benefit, to get support through welfare, that doesn't mean that they should have their rights, their human rights, taken away, Mr Chair. But that is what this bill does. It does it, as a colleague of mine said earlier, in the way of making a young parent return to work earlier than we would expect of any other parent. Saying that actually if you're a young parent, you have to go back to work or study when your child's 1 year or 6 months old. And Mr Chair, Penny Henare, we're talking about this. We actually did go straight back to study and to work. We didn't stay home, Mr Chair, but we chose that. And actually, in hindsight, thinking about it, one of my biggest regrets, having been a young parent, is not taking the time to enjoy being a parent. And that's the pressure that gets put on people, as if you must do all of these things, you must get back into study, you must get into work straight away. If you want to, that's great. But also, we've got to remember, the most important job any of us will do in our lifetime is parenting. And so, as my colleague Louisa said, it's important to remember that bonding goes on, Louisa Wall said, that bonding in that first 3 years is so important. And if we want to make sure that moving forward into the future, we have a generation of citizens that are able to make a valuable contribution, then we'll make sure that we support their parents to be able to support them well now, Mr Chair. So, Mr Chair, I'm going to leave it at that for now. Hopefully I get an opportunity to take another call. But there are so many reasons that we're not supporting this bill. Of course we support young people to go on and get education, to go on into employment. But the way in which the national government is trying to do it won't be successful, hasn't been successful, Mr Chair. And actually, Mr Chair, it's detrimental to our young people.
Mr Chair.
The Honourable Anne Tolley.